The whole town fell silent when the cowboy stepped forward, but what he said next wasn't meant for them. A church hall buzzes with whispers as snowmelt drips from muddy boots onto the wooden floor. A woman grips the edge of a bench so tightly her knuckles turn pale. Across the room, a folded stack of old letters trembles in a sheriff's hand. Then a cowboy rises from the back wall, his chair scraping sharply through the silence. Every eye turns toward him, but he's only looking at one person. And before anyone can stop what's coming, the room changes in a way no one expected. If stories of love, dignity, and second chances speak to your heart, stay with us and share where you're watching from. The stagecoach rolled into Bitter Creek beneath a pale autumn sky. Dust drifted behind the wheels and settled across the main street. Horses stamped beside the hitching posts. A freight wagon rattled past the feed store. The scent of leather, coffee, and dry sage hung in the cool Wyoming air. Delilah Reed sat still for a moment after the coach stopped. 5 days on rough roads had left every bone in her body aching. Her gloved hands rested on a small brown suitcase worn smooth at the corners. Inside were 2 dresses, a Bible, a sewing kit, and every letter Everett Quinn had ever sent her. She took a slow breath. Then she stepped down. The conversation along the street seemed to pause. Not completely. Just enough. Enough for her to notice. A few young men standing outside the barber shop exchanged glances. 2 women near the mercantile lowered their voices and leaned closer together. Someone chuckled. Someone else whispered. Delilah kept her shoulders straight. She had spent most of her life being noticed for reasons that had nothing to do with who she was. She had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes the only thing a person truly owned. She looked around the station yard. Searching. Waiting. Everett Quinn had written for nearly 8 months. His letters had spoken of Wyoming sunsets, hard work, and building a future together. He had described himself as an ordinary ranch hand trying to make a decent life. Not wealthy, not important, just lonely. She had believed him. Now she searched every face in the crowd. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then nearly an hour. The afternoon sun slipped lower. People came and went. Still no Everett. The station master, a thin man with silver hair, finally approached. "You waiting on someone, ma'am?" "Yes, sir," Delilah replied softly. "Everett Quinn." Recognition flickered across his face. Not familiarity. Something else. Something uncomfortable. "He'll likely show," he said, but his voice carried little confidence. Delilah thanked him anyway. She picked up her suitcase and waited longer. Then, just as shadows stretched across the street, a black carriage stopped outside the station. A young man stepped down. Well-dressed, clean boots, expensive coat. Nothing like the struggling ranch hand from the letters. Delilah stared. The man stared back. It was Everett. She knew it instantly from the small photograph he had once mailed. For one brief moment, relief flooded through her. Then she saw his expression. The relief vanished. Everett didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't step forward. He simply stood there looking at her, looking far too long. The murmurs around them began again. Delilah felt every eye in Bitter Creek settle upon the 2 of them. Finally, she gathered herself. "Mr. Quinn?" His jaw tightened. A woman emerged from the carriage behind him. Older. Sharp-faced. Ruth Quinn. His mother. Ruth looked Delilah up and down without bothering to hide it. The silence became unbearable. Delilah's fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. "Everett," she said quietly. "It's me, Delilah." He swallowed, looked at the people watching, looked at his mother, then back at Delilah. For a second she thought he might say her name. Instead, he shook his head. "There's been a misunderstanding." The words landed harder than a slap. Delilah blinked. What? Everett shifted uncomfortably. This isn't what I expected. A nervous laugh came from somewhere in the crowd. Delilah heard it. So did everyone else. Color rose into Everett's face. He seemed more concerned about the audience than the woman standing before him. You wrote to me, Delilah said. Her voice remained calm. That somehow made it worse. Everett looked away. I think it would be best if we leave things here. Ruth Quinn stepped forward immediately. Yes, she said. That would be best for everyone. Everyone. As if Delilah wasn't standing right there. The crowd had gone completely silent now, watching, waiting, enjoying the spectacle. Delilah felt her throat tighten, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers. Not for a man who couldn't even look her in the eye. Everett climbed back into the carriage, without another word, without an apology, without so much as asking whether she had a place to sleep. The carriage rolled away. Dust followed behind it. Delilah stood alone in the middle of Bitter Creek, her suitcase beside her feet. The letters in her bag suddenly felt heavier than stone. A woman across the street whispered something. Another laughed. Delilah bent down and picked up her suitcase. Then she walked, one step at a time. Head held high, past the staring faces, past the feed store, past the blacksmith, past every person who expected her to break. She did not. At the end of the street, she found a small boarding house with a sign swinging gently above the porch. Martha Green's Rooms. The owner answered after the second knock. She was broad-shouldered, gray-haired, and carried flour on her apron. Her eyes moved from Delilah's face to the suitcase, then toward the crowd still watching from down the street. Understanding settled quietly across her features. You need a room? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Martha stepped aside immediately. Come on in. No questions. No judgment. Just kindness. Inside, the smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. For the first time all day, Delilah nearly cried. That night she sat alone in a small upstairs room. A single oil lamp glowed on the washstand. The letters lay spread across the bed. She read them again. This time she noticed things she had missed before. The expensive stationery. The careful omissions. The way Everett always asked about her cooking, sewing, and housekeeping. Never her dreams, never her hopes, never her heart. A slow realization settled over her. Everett Quinn had never been poor. He had never needed saving. He had simply wanted someone willing to work. Someone convenient. Someone he imagined would arrive grateful for whatever scraps he offered. Outside, wind rattled the window pane. Delilah folded the letters and placed them back into her suitcase. Tomorrow, she would need to find work. Tomorrow, she would need to decide what came next. Across town, standing beside the hitching rail outside the saloon, Mason Walker watched the light burning in the upstairs window of Martha Green's boarding house. He had witnessed every moment at the station, every word, every silence. The cold wind tugged at the brim of his hat. He said nothing. But long after everyone else went home, his eyes remained fixed on that small square of lamplight, glowing against the darkness of Bitter Creek. By morning, Delilah Reed learned how fast a small town could chew on a woman's name. She came down the stairs at Martha Green's boarding house with her sewing basket in one hand and her gloves folded in the other. The dining room smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and yesterday's biscuits warming on the stove. Two men at the corner table stopped talking when she entered. Martha noticed. She set a chipped blue cup beside Delilah's plate and poured coffee without asking. Best to eat before the street wakes up, Martha said. Delilah gave her a small nod. Thank you, ma'am. Outside, Bitter Creek had already begun its whispering. By noon, she had found 3 doors closed to her. The mercantile needed no help. The laundry had no place for another pair of hands. The cafe owner looked at her dress, her face, then at the floor, and said business was slow. At the feed store, a boy no older than 16 muttered, "That's the bride Quinn sent back." Delilah did not turn around. She carried her sewing basket back to Martha's with the same slow steps she had used the day before. Only this time the street felt longer. For the next week, she took what work she could get: a shirt mended for 12 cents, a torn curtain patched for Mrs. Bell at the bakery, 2 baskets of washing from the doctor's house, hauled through cold wind with her sleeves damp to the elbow. She kept every receipt folded inside her Bible. On Thursday afternoon, while returning a stack of clean linens, Delilah heard a child cry out near the South Road. A small bay mare had shied beside a wagon loaded with fence wire. The girl on its back slipped hard into the dirt. The horse danced sideways, reins dragging. Delilah dropped the linen bundle and ran. The child lay near the wheel rut, stunned, one boot twisted beneath her skirt. Delilah knelt beside her, careful but firm. "Don't move yet, sweetheart." The girl blinked up at her. Dust clung to her cheek. "My pa will be mad." "Not if he's got sense," Delilah said. She untied her own scarf and folded it beneath the girl's wrist where the skin had scraped raw. Her hands moved steady. Not quick, not showy, just sure. That was how Mason Walker found them. He came down from the livery at a near run, coat open, hat low, breath tight from fear he would not show in front of the street. "Lucy." The girl looked ashamed before she looked hurt. "I'm all right, Pa." Mason crouched beside her. His eyes moved from Lucy's face to Delilah's hands, then to the scarf already darkening with dust and a little blood. "Did she hit her head?" "No, sir," Delilah said. "But her wrist needs washing, and that boot ought to come off before it swells." Mason held her gaze for half a second. Then he nodded. No argument. No suspicion. Just trust given because the situation required it. He lifted Lucy carefully. Delilah picked up the fallen linens with one hand and Lucy's hat with the other. At the doctor's office, she waited outside on the porch while Mason stayed in with his daughter. Wind pushed loose leaves along the plank boards. A loose shutter tapped against the wall. After a while, Lucy came out with her wrist wrapped in clean cloth. She held Delilah's scarf in her good hand. "I'm sorry it got ruined." Delilah smiled faintly. "It was only a scarf." Lucy touched the edge of it. "It was pretty." Mason stepped out behind her. "Miss Reed," he said, "I owe you." "No, sir, you don't." He seemed to consider that answer longer than most men would. 2 days later, Martha Green found Delilah in the kitchen, mending a torn cuff by lamplight. "Mason Walker's cook quit," Martha said, setting a flour sack on the table. "Went east to care for her sister. He asked if you might take temporary work at his ranch." Delilah's needle stopped. The boarding house grew quiet around her. "What kind of work?" "Cooking, washing, some mending, housekeeping. Nothing improper. He's a decent man." Delilah looked at the small pile of coins near her elbow. Not enough for another week. Not enough for a ticket home. Not enough for pride to eat. The next morning, Mason drove a wagon to the boarding house himself. He did not come inside. He stood by the gate with his hat in his hands while Martha helped Delilah carry her suitcase down the porch steps. The ride to the Walker place followed a road that left town behind fast. Bitter Creek shrank into a strip of roofs and chimney smoke. Ahead, the Wind River foothills rose blue and gray beneath a wide sky. Mason's ranch sat in a shallow valley, with a barn, a smokehouse, 2 corrals, and a whitewashed gate that needed fresh paint. A bell hung beside the porch. A stack of chopped wood stood neat beneath a tarp. Lucy met them at the steps. She wore the same dress from the fall, only now the sleeve had torn at the elbow. Delilah noticed. That evening, after supper, she sat near the stove and repaired it with blue thread from her basket. Lucy watched every stitch. "You can make it look new?" "No," Delilah said, "but I can make it hold." Lucy smiled at that. A real smile. Bright enough to make Mason pause in the doorway with 2 tin cups of coffee in his hands. He set one beside Delilah. "Thank you," he said. "For the dress? For more than that." Delilah lowered her eyes to the sleeve. The needle passed through cloth, pulled tight, and disappeared again. That night, after Lucy had gone to bed, Delilah stepped into the hallway to fetch water from the back room. She stopped when she heard Sheriff Ben Harper's voice from the porch. "You sure about this, Mason? Town's already talking." Mason's answer came low. "Town talks when the wind changes." "And Ruth Quinn?" A pause. "She can talk herself dry." Delilah stood still, hand resting on the water pail. Then Mason said, quiet as a man stating a fact he had no need to dress up, "That woman is stronger than anyone in Bitter Creek knows." The boards creaked under Delilah's feet. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inside, she held the empty pail and did not move for a long while. "Do you want me to continue?" The words lingered in her mind long after the voices on the porch faded. Strong. No one had called her that before. Useful, yes. Dependable often. Strong was different. The next morning arrived with a thin layer of frost silvering the fence rails. Delilah rose before daylight, lit the kitchen stove and kneaded biscuit dough while the house still slept. The smell of coffee soon drifted through the rooms. By the time Mason entered, she was setting plates on the table. He nodded once. "Morning. Morning." Nothing more. Yet something had changed. Not enough to name. Just enough to notice. Winter settled over Bitter Creek 1 careful inch at a time. The cottonwoods lost their leaves. The mornings grew sharper. The mountains turned white. At the Walker Ranch, routines formed naturally. Lucy carried books into the kitchen after supper. Delilah helped her sound out difficult words beside the lamplight. Some nights the girl stumbled over every third sentence. Other nights she read entire pages without stopping. Whenever that happened, she looked toward her father first, then toward Delilah, as if both victories belonged to all 3 of them. The house slowly felt less empty. Even Mason seemed to linger indoors longer than before. Sometimes he sat repairing harness straps while Lucy read aloud. Sometimes he sharpened tools beside the stove. Sometimes he simply listened. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. Outside the ranch, however, Bitter Creek remained. Bitter Creek. Rumors traveled faster than wagons. One Saturday afternoon, Delilah entered the mercantile to buy thread. Conversation stopped. A woman near the fabric counter lowered her voice. Another smiled without kindness. Delilah paid for her supplies and left without acknowledging either of them. Behind her, the whispers resumed. The following week brought the first church social of the winter season. Lucy begged her father to attend. After considerable persuasion, Mason finally agreed. The church stood near the center of town, its white steeple visible from nearly every road leading into Bitter Creek. People filled the pews. Children chased one another outside. Women carried covered dishes into the fellowship hall. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Then Delilah heard laughter. Not loud, not meant for her ears, but close enough. A group of women stood near the refreshment table. One glanced toward Delilah. Another smirked. A third whispered something that caused the others to cover their mouths. Delilah continued arranging plates. She kept her eyes on her work. Years of experience had taught her exactly how to survive moments like this. Pretend not to hear. Pretend not to care. Pretend until the moment passes. Unfortunately, it did not pass. One woman finally spoke loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Well, I suppose some men will take whatever arrives at their doorstep." A few people laughed nervously. The room tightened. Delilah placed the last plate onto the table. Her hands remained steady. Only her eyes lowered. Then a chair scraped sharply against the floor. Everyone turned. Lucy Walker stood beside her seat. 11 years old, small for her age, face flushed red with anger. "My father didn't take anybody," she said. The room froze. Lucy pointed toward Delilah. "She helps people, more than any of you." Silence followed. Real silence. The kind that fills a room when shame arrives unexpectedly. One woman opened her mouth, then closed it again. Across the hall, Mason slowly rose from his chair. He was not a loud man, never had been, which made his voice far more effective. "If anybody has something to song about Miss Reed," he said quietly, "say it to me instead." No one answered, not even the women who had started it. A minute later, conversations resumed, but softer now, careful. Delilah looked down at Lucy. The girl stared stubbornly ahead, refusing to back down. Delilah touched her shoulder gently. "Thank you." Lucy nodded once, as if defending her had been the simplest thing in the world. That night, snow began falling. Large flakes drifted past the ranch windows, while supper cooked on the stove. For the first time in months, Delilah felt something close to belonging, which was exactly when trouble returned. 3 days later, a carriage rolled through the front gate. Delilah recognized it immediately. Everett Quinn stepped down. His coat looked newer than before. His smile looked practiced. Mason watched from the barn. Lucy watched from the porch. Delilah stood very still. Everett removed his hat. "I came to make things right." Nobody spoke. He cleared his throat. "I was wrong, Delilah." The words hung in the cold air. Then he raised his voice slightly. "I want to marry you, just as we planned." The ranch hands stopped working. Even the horses seemed to pause. By evening, the entire town knew. Bitter Creek had a new story, and everyone wanted to see how it ended. That night, Delilah couldn't sleep. Wind rattled the window. Around midnight, she stepped outside for air. Voices drifted from the dark side of the stable. She recognized Everett immediately. The second voice belonged to Clyde Mercer. "Without her," Everett said, "the bank won't extend another month." Clyde laughed. "You don't want the woman. You want what comes with fixing your reputation. Call it whatever you like. Then you'd better convince her." The conversation ended with bootsteps crunching through snow. Delilah remained hidden beside the fence. Her fingers tightened around the porch railing. The cold no longer bothered her. At last, she understood. Everett Quinn had not returned because he loved her. He had returned because he needed something. And for the second time, he believed she was something he could use. Inside the house, a lamp still burned in Mason Walker's study window. Delilah stood in the darkness looking toward it, then toward the road where Everett had disappeared. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, the choice before her felt larger than herself. And somewhere beyond the ranch, winter continued gathering strength. The first storm arrived 3 days later. Snow swept across the valley in long white ribbons. Fence posts disappeared one by one. The road into Bitter Creek became little more than a pale line beneath the drifts. Inside the ranch house, Delilah rose before dawn, as she always did. She fed wood into the stove, mixed biscuit dough, poured coffee into Mason's tin cup before he came downstairs. Small habits had quietly settled into place. The kind that happened when people shared the same roof long enough. Mason stepped into the kitchen wearing his heavy winter coat. Snow clung to the shoulders. Lucy sat at the table with a spelling book open beside her breakfast plate. "You don't have to go today," Delilah said. The words escaped before she could stop them. Mason looked toward the window. The wind pushed against the glass hard enough to make it rattle. "The herd won't wait for better weather." His voice remained calm, but he lingered a second longer than usual. Lucy lowered her spoon. "You'll come back before supper?" A faint smile touched Mason's face. "That's the plan." He reached down and squeezed her shoulder. Then his eyes briefly found Delilah's. Neither spoke. A moment later, he was gone. The front door closed. Cold air swept through the hallway. The storm worsened throughout the day. By noon, visibility had nearly vanished. By evening, 2 of Mason's ranch hands returned alone. Their horses were exhausted. Ice coated their coats and hats. Delilah knew something was wrong before they spoke. "Lost him near Granite Ridge," one man said. "Wind came down the canyon. We got separated." Lucy turned pale. The room fell silent. No one touched their supper. That night, Sheriff Ben Harper arrived. Snow covered his shoulders. His beard was white with frost. "We'll head out at first light." Delilah stared at the map spread across the table. Granite Ridge. She knew the area only from hearing Mason describe it. Steep slopes, rocky draws, deep snow this time of year. Dangerous country. The search party left before sunrise. Hours passed. Then another day. Nothing. The storm continued. Men returned cold and discouraged. Each report sounded worse than the last. By the third day, people stopped speaking hopefully. Delilah noticed it in the way they looked at Lucy, in the way conversations ended when the girl entered a room, in the extra silence at supper. Lucy sat near the stove that evening holding her father's pocket watch. The watch had stopped. No one wound it. No one seemed able to. Finally, Delilah stood. "I'm going." Sheriff Ben looked up sharply. "No. I know where they searched. You don't know that mountain. I know Mason." The room grew quiet. Sheriff Ben removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, then looked toward the window, toward the endless white beyond it. "We leave in 30 minutes. The search resumed under a sky the color of steel. Wind still swept through the hills, but the worst of the storm had finally moved east. Delilah rode beside the sheriff. Every breath burned. Every mile felt longer than the last. Near sunset, they reached a narrow canyon below Granite Ridge. One of the horses suddenly stopped, ears forward, listening. Delilah heard it then, a faint sound. Not the wind, not an animal. A voice. She slid from the saddle. "Wait!" The others froze. Again. Faint. Broken. Somewhere below. They climbed down into a rocky draw half buried beneath snow, and there he was. Mason Walker, pinned beneath part of a fallen tree. One ranch hand beside him, another farther up the slope. Alive, but barely. Relief struck so hard Delilah nearly lost her footing. Mason opened his eyes when she knelt beside him. For a second he seemed confused. Then recognition appeared. "Delilah? You're late for supper." A weak laugh escaped him. Even now. Even here. The sheriff organized the rescue. The injured men were wrapped in blankets. A fire was started beneath an overhang. Night settled over the mountains. Travel became impossible. They would have to wait until morning. Hours passed beside the fire. The others slept when they could. Delilah remained awake. Mason drifted in and out. Once, sometime after midnight, he opened his eyes. The firelight flickered across his face. "You should have stayed home." "So should you." His lips twitched. Then the smile faded. For a long moment, he watched the flames. "I thought I wasn't getting out." Delilah said nothing. The mountains around them seemed impossibly still. Finally, Mason spoke again. Quietly, honestly, the way people do when they believe there is no reason left to hide anything. "The thing that scared me wasn't dying." She turned toward him. His eyes remained on the fire. "It was thinking I might never see you again." The words settled softly between them. Neither moved. Neither looked away. The wind outside the canyon eased. The fire crackled. And for the first time, Neither of them pretended not to understand what had been growing between them. 3 days later, Mason returned home. The valley welcomed him like a man returned from the dead. Lucy cried openly when she saw him. Sheriff Ben shook his hand twice. Even the ranch hands smiled more than usual. Life slowly returned to normal, or something close to it. Then, one cold morning, a rider arrived carrying official papers. The envelope bore the seal of the Wyoming Territorial Bank. Mason opened it at the kitchen table. Read it once. Then again. The color drained from his face. Delilah noticed immediately. So what is it? Mason folded the paper carefully. Too carefully. Like a man trying not to break something. A debt. What debt? His eyes remained fixed on the letter. I don't know. Outside, wind rattled the porch bell. Inside, the kitchen suddenly felt colder than the storm had ever been, because the letter claimed ownership of a debt tied to the ranch. A debt now held by Clyde Mercer. And unless it was paid soon, everything Mason Walker owned could be taken away. The letter remained on the kitchen table long after breakfast ended. The bank seal stared up from the paper like a warning. Outside, snow slid from the barn roof in heavy sheets. The worst of winter was finally loosening its grip on Bitter Creek, but spring had not yet arrived. Mason read the notice again that evening, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. Delilah watched from the stove. He had survived blizzards, droughts, broken cattle markets. Yet somehow this frightened him more, because this threat carried a signature, a deadline, and no clear way to fight it. Within a week, the entire valley knew. Clyde Mercer made certain of that. He arrived in town wearing a black wool coat and the confident smile of a man who enjoyed watching others struggle. At the mercantile, at church, outside the feed store, people repeated the same story. Mason Walker was losing his ranch. Some pitied him. Others waited to see what happened. Then Everett Quinn appeared once more. This time he carried an offer. He requested a meeting at Martha Green's boarding house. Delilah almost refused. Almost. But curiosity won. Everett sat in the parlor beside the window. His hair was neatly combed, his boots polished. Everything about him looked prepared, except his eyes. Those looked desperate. You heard about Mason's debt. Delilah remained standing. Yes, I can solve it. She said nothing. Everett leaned forward. The Quinn family still has credit in Cheyenne. I can arrange financing. Clyde Mercer would back away. And why would you do that? His answer came too quickly. Because I care about you. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Delilah remembered the stagecoach, the crowd, his face turning away. She remembered every minute of it. You don't, she said quietly. Everett's jaw tightened. You don't understand. No, I think I finally do. The conversation ended shortly after, but not before Everett revealed the true price. Marriage. He wanted Delilah to become his wife. Word spread through Bitter Creek before sunset. By the next morning, people spoke of little else. Many believed she would accept. Some even said she should. After all, a marriage could save the Walker Ranch. A marriage could protect Lucy's future. A marriage could fix everything. At least on paper. The days that followed became strangely quiet. Mason never asked what she planned to do. Not once. That somehow hurt more than if he had. He worked longer hours. Spent evenings in the barn. Avoided conversations that might force either of them to speak honestly. One afternoon, Lucy found Delilah mending a coat beside the window. Are you leaving? The needle paused. No one said I was. But people keep talking. Lucy stared at the floorboards. Then she whispered, I don't want you to go. Delilah reached out and squeezed her hand. Neither said anything else. Across town, Sheriff Ben Harper continued investigating the bank claim. Something about the paperwork bothered him. The dates, the signatures, the timing. One rainy afternoon, he found himself sorting through old records stored in the courthouse basement. Dust covered everything. Boxes sat untouched for years. Near sunset, he discovered a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Letters belonging to Ruth Quinn. The first one changed everything. By the time Sheriff Ben finished reading, he removed his glasses and sat down heavily. Because the truth was finally sitting in front of him. And it was uglier than anyone expected. 3 days later, the entire town gathered inside the church hall. Clyde Mercer attended. Everett Quinn attended. Ruth Quinn sat rigidly beside her son. Mason arrived late and stood near the back wall. Delilah entered quietly through the side door. The room hummed with anticipation. Sheriff Ben stepped forward, holding a stack of yellowed papers. "I found correspondence concerning Miss Reed's arrival in Bitter Creek." The room fell silent. He read several letters aloud, one after another. Each one painted the same picture. Months earlier, Ruth Quinn had discovered who Delilah truly was. She had immediately opposed the marriage. More importantly, she had paid Everett to reject her upon arrival. Paid him. The evidence sat plainly on the page. Amounts, dates, instructions. The church hall erupted. People turned toward Everett, toward Ruth. Whispers became gasps. Gasps became outrage. Everett's face drained white. For the first time, he had nowhere to hide. "No," he said weakly. "It wasn't like that." But the letters spoke for themselves. Every excuse collapsed. Every lie followed. Delilah remained perfectly still, strangely calm. The truth hurt less than the uncertainty ever had, because now she finally knew. She had never failed some impossible test. She had simply been betrayed. When the noise finally settled, all eyes turned toward her. What would she do? Would she still accept Everett's proposal? Would she sacrifice herself to save the ranch? Would she walk away from both men? Nobody knew. Then Mason moved. One step. Then another. He walked to the front of the room. No speech prepared. No dramatic gesture. Just honesty. The kind that takes years to gather. He stopped beside Delilah. His voice carried across the hall. "I was ashamed of a lot of things in my life." The room listened. But I was never ashamed of her. No one moved. No one spoke. Mason looked directly at Delilah, then continued. "And if I had to start over from the beginning, I'd choose her again." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Even the floorboards seemed to grow still. Delilah felt her throat tighten. Not because everyone was watching, but because she believed him. Every single word. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach months ago, she felt seen. Not judged, not measured. Seen. Beside her, Mason offered his hand. Not demanding, not expecting, simply offering. Delilah looked at it, then placed her hand in his. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Outside, church bells began ringing for evening service. Spring arrived several weeks later. Snow retreated from the foothills. Grass returned to the valley. Wildflowers appeared beside the fences. On a bright morning beneath the Wind River Mountains, chairs were arranged across a field of fresh green grass. Lucy carried a bouquet nearly as large as she was. Martha Green cried before the ceremony even started. Sheriff Ben smiled more than anyone had ever seen him smile. When Delilah walked toward Mason, she no longer noticed who was watching. The people who once whispered sat quietly. The people who once laughed lowered their eyes. None of that mattered anymore. Only the man waiting for her mattered. The man who had looked beyond appearances, beyond gossip, beyond fear. The minister finished the final blessing. The wind moved softly across the meadow. Church bells echoed faintly from town. And as Mason took Delilah's hand beneath the Wyoming sky, she realized something she had crossed half a continent to learn. She had come west searching for a husband. Instead, she found a home. She found a family. And she found a man brave enough to choose her in front of the whole world. As the sun dipped behind the Wind River Mountains, and the last of the wedding guests drifted home, it's easy to imagine Delilah standing there for a moment longer, listening to the wind move through the grass, not thinking about the people who had left, not thinking about the road that brought her there, just feeling the warmth of a hand that never let go. And maybe that's where this story reaches beyond Bitter Creek, because if you place yourself in Delilah's shoes for a moment, if you remember a time when you felt overlooked, judged, or left behind, you know how tempting it can be to believe that one painful moment defines your worth. But sometimes the people who walk away are not the ones who determine your future. Sometimes healing begins when someone sees the strength in you that you've almost forgotten yourself. The beautiful thing about love is that it often arrives quietly, not with grand promises, not with perfect words, but with steady kindness, patience, loyalty, and the courage to stay. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear from you. What moment stayed with you the most? And if you enjoy stories about second chances, enduring love, and the people who find their way home when life takes an unexpected turn, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more heartfelt journeys waiting just down the trail, and I'd be honored to share them with you.